so much for joining us for today's webinar series, which is the final session organized by Research with International Students as part of the panel season that we've been hosting over the last few months. Since February, we've been hosting a series of webinars that has focused around the theme of polycrisis and addressing polycrisis in our research related to international students. If we haven't met before, then my name is Jenna Mittelmeier. I'm the lead organizer for RIS. I'm afraid that Anne Campbell, who was listed to lead the session, isn't able to join us for personal reasons today. So you're stuck with me. Anne would have introduced this topic much more eloquently, but I'll do my best to do this topic justice today. If it's your first RIS event, and I can see a few new names today, I'll put some links in the chat in just a moment so that you can hear more about us. But we're a network of global scholars whose work focuses on international students, and we aim to encourage more critical conversations in research related to this topic. I'll also add to the chat in a moment links to the recordings from some of our other sessions within this series if you'd like to catch up on anything you might have missed. Just by way of introduction today, though, most of our other sessions in this series have focused on the treatment of international students through various polycrisis conditions, including how they're framed across various systems and how various polycrisis elements impact their experiences. But we wanted to include today's session and kind of end on this note, focusing on sustainabilities to expand this series beyond individuals and to connect back to the planetary conditions that are underpinning our sector, but also everything in our human lives. So today's panel thinks about the intersections of student mobilities and sustainabilities, questioning what is the impact of our sector on our planet and whether international education causes harm to our planetary conditions. Some of the examples that we'll be talking about today that I'm sure will come up in our speakers' presentations are things like the greenhouse gas emissions that are produced through the frequent travel that our students undertake or that university staff are undertaking through processes like international recruitment or the water and energy resources that are required to sustain the servers for the AI tools that are often suggested to international students to support things like translation and writing. So there are these really ethical questions around how sustainable are the practices within our sector. But there are also ethical questions around how the sector uses sustainabilities as a marketing tool to brand our institutions as these sustainable and planet-conscious places, which Pii-Tuulia is going to speak about, which may or may not align with the realities of our university activities. So this leads us to kind of question if there are benefits which outweigh the harm that our sector is producing. Thinking, for example, about sustainabilities education and whether our students are leaving with a greater understanding and sense of care for their planet and environmental awareness, which is what Giorgio is going to be speaking about. So are they more aware of our planetary conditions than when they began their studies? So that's all to say what we want this panel to question are things like, does international student mobility harm the planet? And what is the environmental impact of our sector? So we've got two speakers today who are going to be sharing their work. I'll ask them to introduce themselves at the start of their talk, but briefly, they include Pii-Tuulia Nikula and Giorgio di Pietro. Pii-Tuulia's discussion is going to focus on green initiatives in international marketing, questioning whether they are simply sustainability on display. And then this is followed by Giorgio, who's going to be sharing findings from a survey about whether international education mobility impacts young people's environmental attitudes. So how the session will work, as with our former panels, each speaker will have about 20 to 25 minutes to present their work, and then we'll come together in the last portion of the section for a collective discussion about the panel topic and about sustainabilities. So please do be thinking of your questions that you might want to ask in the last portion of the day, which you can write in the chat as we go along, or raise your hand at the end if you'd like to ask your question out loud. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, who is Pii-Tuulia. So Pii-Tuulia, over to you.
Kia koutou, and good evening and good morning. I'm joining you today from New Zealand, so it's towards the evening night time here. And thank you again for the invitation to be part of the panel. So I'll just start sharing my my screen. So again, today my presentation will be looking at international education marketing and to what extent do we see sustainability as part of this kind of marketing activities. However, it's just an area of my research that has been looking at international education as well as sustainability questions. So I've been actively working with these questions for about 10 years. Looking at questions around teaching and learning, organizational practices. I guess key focus in a lot of my international education research has been the climate impact of our sector, but obviously I'll be today talking about other environmental and wider sustainability challenges as well. And if anybody's interested, last year Hongpeng Chang and I co-authored the discipline guide for research with international students, so it's available for free on RIS website. And my work has been a bit of a combination of research and activism. So I was also one of the co-founders of CANI, the Climate Action Network for International Educators, incentivizing institutions and international education operators across the globe to take climate action as well. So today, because my topic includes the word sustainability, which is probably one of those words and concepts that's used very differently depending on where you look, what type of documents you're reviewing. But sustainability as a concept is obviously not just one aspect. So sometimes we see sustainability and sustainable referring to just economic or financial questions. Sometimes it's only used for the environmental domain. But sustainability basically means that we have a system where we're able to live within planetary boundaries. So basically the capacity of our planet. We're meeting the needs of the people first, and then basically any other economic activity will be kind of following from there. So this is kind of the circle model. I'm maybe more of a believer of the nested model, where basically the planetary boundaries, so the environmental ceiling, is kind of the key thing that we have to focus on. So planetary boundaries have been. There's 9 planetary boundaries that have been quantified by researchers, and the Stockholm Resilience Center and their resources are really good if somebody is interested in. And the bad news is that currently we are basically breaching, overshooting in 7 out of the 9 planetary boundaries. So for us to have a safe operating space, well, so the future generations can enjoy the planet, we would need to significantly reduce our environmental impact in many different areas. So obviously, some of the key aspects that we really have to look at the moment is biodiversity loss, climate change. We have issues elsewhere as well, biochemical flows, novel entities which impact we're not quite aware of. But we have issues in other aspects as well that we kind of have to actively start addressing if we want to ensure that in the future generations have also a livable planet. So in international education context, aspects around education for sustainable development, so for example, teaching sustainability to international students has been studied for quite a while, and there's been multiple different studies focusing on how we can help international learners to learn about these different issues. And this is often the aspect where universities can find kind of the easiest synergies in saying we're doing something good, because it's part of obviously a key operation of universities to do teaching and learning. And obviously research is the other one where we can quite often find this kind of synergies and say, the research that we do in sustainability will help and have this kind of social impact. The aspect that has been kind of the most recent one has been the aspect around organizational impact and impact of international education operations on the planet. And when I first started having these conversations about a decade ago, there were a lot of people involved in international education who did not understand that the sector has an environmental impact. So there was not a lot of awareness of, for example, aviation being one of the most energy efficient, energy heavy kind of activities that you can be involved in. We also do know that in at least some industry surveys, we see that prospective students do consider sustainability as one aspect when deciding where to study, including institutions as well as destinations. But it would not be wouldn't be often kind of a primary driver of that kind of destination choice. So it might be there, but how important it really is in choosing where to study is quite unclear still. There's obviously been other aspects that have been incentivizing universities to take action as well. And sustainability rankings, whatever we think about rankings, but they definitely have been incentivizing universities to think about sustainability aspects. And there's some kind of key sustainability ranking initiatives that quite a few universities now participate. There's still quite limited academic research on specific aspects of especially environmental sustainability in the context of international education. And one of them is how universities integrate sustainability and green credentials into their marketing activities when trying to recruit new international students. So we can think when we think about marketing and thinking about using sustainability as a signal potentially for international students that we would be a good destination or institution to choose. So signal could be thought about as a kind of an action on attribute that has some kind of credible and valuable information for prospective students and other partners involved in the choice of institutions. And traditionally, when we use signaling theory, it's been based on kind of this assumption that those institutions that do have the attributes are the only ones that can send signals that are, about this kind of aspects such as sustainability. That they're very costly to or difficult to replicate for others who don't actually have good sustainability attributes. But this is not often the case when it comes to organizational sustainability. But quite often we do see that organizations can make quite bold sustainability claims, even if their kind of internal practices might not be aligning with what is being stated. And there are questions around, this kind of engagement with sustainability, whether it's a symbolic, we make symbolic statements about how committed we are to sustainability, or whether we actually have made changes to our practices and we're kind of walking the walk rather than just talking the talk. And in other contexts, especially kind of private organizations, research has really highlighted these issues where sustainability initiatives are used in a way that it is false. It could be very vague. There might be omissions and aspects that kind of reflect greenwashing type of practices. And the issue here is obviously as well that when we are trying to send a signal to prospective international students, is about, can they actually understand what are we saying about sustainability? What does it actually mean, the statements we're making? And would they be able to somehow easily observe whether the sustainability statements of one university are more valid and credible than from another institution? But recently we have also seen a lot of other type of activities, not necessarily within universities, but across other type of organizations. So we also have organizations who have started become really careful about what they say about their sustainability. And we can see now this kind of trend towards green hushing, which means that they might be still continuing the activities, but they're very careful in terms of whether they convey to kind of end users or customers or prospective students in this case, thinking, maybe the target market doesn't really care about it too much, or they're really careful about how they want to kind of talk about their sustainability initiatives as well. So in a research that I'm kind of currently starting to write up, I've been looking at how New Zealand universities use these wider sustainability claims and green credentials in their international education marketing. So for that purpose, I've been reviewing their prospectuses for any kind of content around sustainability or sustainable, and then also including some quantitative, but mainly qualitative because of the issues that come with just focusing on the number of words being used, for example. And then obviously looking at further additional content that aligns with environmental themes, such as environmental issues, climate change, biodiversity, and water, and so on. And what I have been excluding program listings, such as the manual listing of the name of the program, because it's not necessarily an active choice from marketing teams if they list every name of the program. So I haven't been kind of considering them for any of the qualitative analysis that I have been part of. So that's some of the findings. So there are eight universities in New Zealand, so it's not a large group. And overall, when you consider all the content that includes anything to do with sustainable and sustainability, the average number of mentions per international prospectus was 12, but there was quite a range from 1 to 25. But this includes all of the statements, including program names and titles and footnotes and so on. But based on the qualitative assessment of each brochure, I tried to start categorizing them as kind of active, medium, and passive type of institutions in terms of their engagement with different sustainability themes. So there was basically just one which was really, really kind of featuring itself as a sustainability champion. There were 3 that were actively using it in at least a few sections of the brochures and making statements for different areas of sustainability. And then there were 4 where basically one didn't include this topic at all, and the remaining had just kind of 1 or 2 statements about sustainable aspects. So those sustainability statements, what they were associated with, so most were to do with research. So research that's being undertaken at the university by professors and research institutes involved in questions to do with sustainability. That was then followed by study and teaching. So, come here and you can learn about environmental sustainability, or, students at this institution will have skills to consider environmental issues and so on. The third one was about institutional credentials, so green credentials, such as, that we are looking at becoming carbon zero by 2030, or quite often in terms of institutional sustainability rankings. And then the other ones were about the location, for example, being framed as sustainable city, or student union clubs or something around themes to do with sustainability. Just some examples in terms of sustainability statements. And quite a few of these were somewhat vague. Thinking about that, I know quite a lot about the topic, but somebody who doesn't, how would you take, this is top 100 or 10 globally for sustainability, well, what does it mean? And, how is it kind of defined? Or the university has research strengths in many areas, including sustainability, which is a very kind of a large area anyway. So again, obviously in marketing, we always have to think about, you can't put everything in, and these are kind of active choices that are being made in terms of what will be included and what will be excluded. There were some explicit references to sustainable development goals, so those are still quite actively referred in some of the prospectuses as key areas for students to learn from, and research areas, as well as university trying to make an impact towards the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Target year for them is 2030, so I'd expect that will still show up for a couple of years. And then kind of occasional, this kind of generic references to environmental impact or environmental issues. The word environment more often is used for something else, such as campus environment or study environment, rather than anything to do with the ecological aspects as such. Logos being used, but again, if you don't know the logo, it might be difficult for a prospective international student to really understand what does it mean, or is it linked to that type of question around sustainability that I might be interested in. Evidence, if it was used, it was typically referring to the sustainability rankings, so the two kind of largest one, QS and the higher education rankings as well, and sustainability. When more specific issues were mentioned, it was typically just it was climate change. So climate change or emissions. So that's obviously the key topic that's currently a focus for many organizations, including universities. And other issues were really just mentioned, one or maximum two times. So such as biodiversity, coastal ecosystems, and so on. So if it was more specific, it was pretty much always climate change. So again, this is per brochures, but obviously if you'd look through the brochures of all of the mentions, the climate change was quite often repeated as an area of interest. Well, what was missing? A lot of things were missing still. So, in the academic and industrial literature, there's a lot of talk about, the planetary boundaries. There's aspects around environmental and climate justice, aspects that may have to consider, degrowth, post-growth, sufficiency. None of those words were mentioned in any of the brochures. So the discussion is still really at the kind of the key issues that we might be looking at, or this kind of wider statements around sustainability and sustainable. Quite a few universities had, they might have had 20 different qualifications that were something about sustainable, but then there was nothing else really in those brochures. So it was just the name of the program, rather than featuring a student story or alumni or research or something around sustainability, or mentioning sustainability as an aspect for the learners. And it's about, if you're quite active in this area, again, it's an active choice whether you kind of leave that as a kind of a key talking point in your brochure or not. I wasn't surprised, but there was definitely no attempts to raise any awareness of the environmental impact of international student mobility on any of those brochures. So that wasn't mentioned, but I wasn't necessarily expecting it to be mentioned either. I did look at the domestic brochures as well. So I looked at the international first, and that's my key area, but I looked at the domestic ones. And for one, that was very, very passive. The domestic one was all about sustainability. So there clearly is a bit of a distinction, but clearly there could be a distinction in terms of how sustainability is sending an attractive signal to some of those key markets. And maybe a thought underneath that the domestic students care about it, whereas international learners do not. Because it would be otherwise quite difficult to explain why they were so different. But for most, the brochures were very similar, and if sustainability was used in one, it was used in the other one as well. So that could be kind of an interesting comparison point. A lot of universities also produce separate brochures for different target markets. So it might be interesting to look whether, that looks very different in, one written in Mandarin versus, one written in Spanish for another market area, in terms of how much that kind of message is being adjusted depending on those kind of international student populations. I've been looking at the brochures for 3 years now, and while maybe 80% remains similar, you can definitely see that there's changes and things being taken away, and not necessarily always being added, but taken away, or sometimes the message is being changed somewhat. So it's not a static type of data set that you're looking at, and there might be, obviously, if I'd had access to some of those older older international prospectuses, from 10 or 20 years ago, I'm sure that there would be very little about, the topic. So again, the question of access is again something that might be making it a bit problematic. And then finally, for somebody else, maybe it's really about, how do we then, we have this kind of marketing brochures, and we're sending these signals, and we're making statements about sustainability. But I'd be really interested in knowing, how do prospective international students understand and perceive this type of signals as well. So obviously in my teaching, I'm involved with international students, and I teach sustainable business and organizations. And quite often, a lot of these key terms that I've been referring to today might not be so well known by the population. So it is really about, I guess, thinking about what is being said in the brochures align and is also made sense by the actual target audience, so the prospective international students. That was my few cents. So I'll just let Giorgio to start his presentation now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Pii-Tuulia. I think that's such a fascinating and sobering insight into the organizational level understandings of how institutions are using or not using the language of sustainabilities. Colleagues in the room, if you've got any kind of short follow-up questions for Pii-Tuulia, if you could add those to the chat for now. But I think we will now hand over to Giorgio, who's going to shift our thinking towards students. So Giorgio, over to you. And again, colleagues, Pii-Tuulia can answer small questions in the chat, or we'll be coming back to questions across the two panels at the end of the session. So Giorgio, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Jenna. It was very interesting to actually listen to Pii-Tuulia's presentation, and I think it nicely complements with mine, because while she's looking at the kind of institutional perspective, I'm more looking at the student perspective. Let me share my presentations. Yeah. Okay. So my name is Giorgio Di Pietro. I work at the University of Loyola in Seville at the Department of Economics. Again, thank you very much for inviting me to this event. It is a pleasure for me to be able to present my research here. Today, I'll be talking about a paper that I published last year in Journal of Studies in International Education. This paper has been published open access, so anybody can actually read it. In this paper, I look at whether an international education experience promote environmental awareness. What is the starting point? The starting point is that, as we all know, over the last decades, there has been an increase in the number of papers looking at the benefits of studying abroad. Many papers, for instance, have shown that studying abroad improves labor market prospects. So following completion of their studies, former study abroad students are likely to enjoy high earnings. are more likely to find a job. Okay. Also, a study abroad experience is found to facilitate the acquisition of a second language. This experience is also found to promote personal growth and development. Thanks to studying abroad, there is evidence showing that students become more tolerant, more resilient, more mature, more independent, and more confident in their skills and ability. However, much less research has been looked at environmental attitudes as an outcome of studying abroad. There are relatively few studies. These studies are mainly qualitative in their nature, and the few quantitative studies that there are around, they do suffer, in my opinion, from three problems. First, they lack a control group. So basically, they only focus their attention on environmental outcomes of a study abroad student, and they don't compare these outcomes with students who didn't study abroad. Second, these studies are based on small samples. So most students, they have samples that are around 100 students, definitely less than 500 students. And third, and perhaps evenly more important, is that these students have made no attempt in order to control for, I think, the most challenging from a quantitative point of view issue related to studying abroad, which is you need to control for selection into studying abroad. Because the decision to study abroad is a decision that is often associated with characteristics that do affect the outcome of interest. So, for instance, one can imagine that those students who decided to study abroad are likely to display a high level of environmental concern relative to students who didn't study abroad. So, if you don't control for this selection, you may overstate the environmental enhancing effect of studying abroad. So, in my paper, what I've tried to do is to investigate this issue. So, whether studying abroad does have an impact on environmental awareness, but trying to address the three problems that I just mentioned before. So, in my paper, I do have a control group. So I compare environmental attitudes of study abroad participants with those of non-participants. Second, I use a sample size that is quite big, is over 25,000 student observation. Okay, I use a survey that covers people from 27 European Union countries, and also I use data from a survey that is kind of recent because was carried out in 2022. And third, I do control for the endogeneity bias associated with the decision to study abroad, and I do so by using propensity score matching techniques. Propensity score matching techniques are often used in social science in order to evaluate the impact of a program where random assignment is not possible. So, why does studying abroad promote environmental awareness? Well, the first thing to do is obviously that once people decide to study abroad, they kind of exit from their comfort zone. So they enter into contact with cultural values and norms of those countries. And these cultural norms and values of those countries, they cover different areas, including environment. Also, students, when they are abroad, they start to interact with people from different parts of the world. And these people have got their own opinion and view across a number of topics, including the environment. So the idea is that as a result of this, students, while they're abroad, they may, for instance, discover the value of water, the importance of water, the importance of biodiversity, how global warming affects our daily life, the relevance of using transport means that do not pollute. So they become more environmental aware. Also, another possibility is that students they understand that all people live in a world that is highly interconnected, and all people, including students, they do play a role in promoting sustainable development. So protecting the environment is a shared responsibility. So being abroad, I think, made people more aware that there must be some kind of environmental solidarity. Okay, so in order to test this hypothesis, or whether students, while being abroad, they gain an environmental consciousness, I use data from Flash Eurobarometer Survey 502, which is titled Youth and Democracy in the European Year of Youth. This survey was carried out in the first month of 2022 in 27 EU countries. So more precisely, was carried out in February and March of 2022. 2022 was the European Year of Youth. So this survey was kind of carried out also in order to mark that 2022 was the European Year of Youth. The survey is addressed to people aged 15 to 30 and was conducted at the request of the European Commission Director General of Education, Youth, Sport and Culture. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the Eurobarometer surveys are mainly opinion surveys. They are meant to capture Europeans' opinion about issues related to Europe. So, for instance, trust in European institutions or people's attitudes towards European integration. The first European Eurobarometer survey dates back to 1974. Okay, so through this survey, I was able to construct two environmental awareness outcomes. And these two outcomes, they come from responses to two questions where people were asked to indicate three priorities that the European Year of Youth should focus on, or three priorities for the current generation of young people. And people had to indicate three priorities out of 11 priorities. So among the different priorities, you have fighting poverty, promoting peace and security, enhancing employment opportunity, foster the creation of an inclusive society, and etc., etc. In addition, obviously, to environmental protection. So I construct two binary indicators. The first binary indicator takes the value of 1 if the response stated that promoting the environment and fighting climate change is one of the three priorities that the European Year of Youth should focus on, and otherwise 0. And my second indicator is again a binary variable taking the values 1 if the response stated that promoting environmental friendly policy and fighting climate change is one of the three priorities of the current generation of young people, and 0 otherwise. Once I've defined my outcome variable or my dependent variables, I now need to look at the independent variables. So basically the factors that are expected to affect environmental awareness. Obviously, given my hypothesis, my main independent or explanatory variable is participation in study abroad experience. And here, because the data are available like this, I take a broader view. So I create a variable capturing participation in study, training, and apprenticeship activities in another EU country. So again, this is a variable, a binary variable, taking 1 if the respondent has participated in international education activities abroad. Then I also use other inter-level characteristics that are expected to affect environmental awareness. These they include gender, age, and age squared in order to capture the possible non-linear relationship between environmental awareness and age. This is standard standard approach in econometrics. Then I consider people's highest level of educational attainment, whether they have children, and other variables, including obviously nationality and type of residence, where type of residence includes cities or large cities. So let me try to summarize the empirical approach that I have used. This is based basically in 3 steps, where I start to control further for the selection into being abroad, into studying abroad. I started out with this descriptive analysis, and the first thing I do is that I compare the proportion of respondents who stated that environmental protection and fighting climate change is one of the priorities for the EU across study abroad participants and non-study abroad participants. And here are the results. As you can see, this difference is statistically significant in favor of students who have participated across people who have participated in study, training, and apprenticeship activities in another EU country. So, in other words, across my 2 indicators, the majority of people that indicated that environmental protection and fighting climate change is one of the priorities that the EU should focus on is higher among students who participated in study abroad activity compared to people who have not participated in this activity. So, for instance, for my first indicator, the difference is 5%, and because we are talking about big numbers, this difference is statistically significant. And for the second indicator, environmental indicator, this difference is 3%, and again is statistically significant. So these obviously are preliminary results, because in this case, I am not controlling for the selection into study abroad, into studying abroad. So the idea, as I said before, is that there is the risk that in so doing, you are overstating the impact, the environmental impact of studying abroad, because participants and non-participants, they differ along a number of characteristics that on their own, they affect environmental awareness. So these are preliminary results, and it is important to check whether these results, they hold also when one account for differences in individual characteristics between participants and non-participants. And this is exactly what I do in the next slide, where I control for individual level characteristics, and I run a probability regression for the determinants of environmental concern, where I include all my explanatory factors, including participation in study, training, and apprenticeship activities in another country. And here, the main result is reported in red, and it shows that, for instance, students who participated in study, training, and apprenticeship activity in another country are found 3.9 percentage points more likely to indicate promoting the environment and fighting climate change as one of the 3 priorities that the European Year of Youth should focus on. Similarly, people who participated in study, training, and apprenticeship activity in another EU country are found to be 2.5 percentage points more likely to indicate promoting environmentally friendly policy and fight climate change as one of the 3 priorities for the current younger generation. So the results, even when you control for the individual level characteristics, they point always to the same direction, that an international education experience has a positive effect on environmental awareness. So such experience help people to raise their environmental consciousness. Although the effect, as you can see, we're talking about 3.9 percentage point and 2.5 percentage point, is relatively small. Briefly on the other results. So female, as one expected, are found to have a higher level of environmental concern relative to males. Also, more educated people are more likely to indicate environmental protection and fighting climate change as one of the priorities that the EU should focus on. Younger people are found to be more concerned about the environment compared to older people, although the negative effect of age on environmental awareness decline as ages increases, given the positive coefficient on age square. So what we do next is we further try to address the problem of selection into studying abroad by using the propensity score matching. The idea behind the propensity score matching is to match individuals who study training or carried out an internship in another EU country with very similar individuals who did not have these experiences. I don't know how many people here in the audience are familiar with propensity score matching, but in this case, it is implemented in 3 steps. In the first step, what I do is that I calculate for each individual in the sample, based on years or air observed characteristics, the probability to have participated in educational experience abroad. And these probability are estimated using a probit model, okay? And these probability are also called propensity score. In the second step, I group individuals who have similar probabilities of having had an educational experience abroad. And obviously, some of these individuals are found to actually have been abroad, and this is the treatment group, while some individuals with the same probability have found that have not been abroad, and this is the control group. So once I've defined the treatment and the control group, what I do, I simply take the difference in environmental outcome between the treatment group and the control group. So this is more or less, a summary of how propensity score matching works. Before moving to the result of the propensity score matching, this is the probit regression that served as a basis for calculating the propensity score. So the probability of having had an international education abroad. As you can see, the results are very in line with what one would have expected. So, for instance, people with a higher education are more likely to have had an experience abroad, and we all know that somehow higher education, for instance, is an important enabler of temporary education abroad. People who live in large towns or cities are more likely to have studied abroad, who have had an experience abroad, compared to people who live in rural area or people who live in a small or medium-sized town. All the people are more likely to have had an international experience abroad, although because the coefficient on age square is negative, this means that the positive effect on age on having had an experience abroad decline as age increases. Perhaps the more interesting and different result is the fact that males are found to be more likely to have an international education experience abroad compared to females. If you look at studies only focusing on studying abroad, you find the opposite result. But here, because I've used a broader definition of studying abroad that includes also training, includes also apprenticeship, these are training and apprenticeship, these are abroad are activities that they tend to attract more males than females. So that's my explanation for the negative coefficient that you have got on females. Moving on the result of the propensity score matching estimator, you find that all these coefficients are statistically significant. So what does it mean? It means that no matter what propensity score matching estimator you use, you can use the nearest neighbor with 1 to 6 or 1 to 10, or you can use the radius propensity score matching estimator with caliper 0.01, 0.2, 0.5, you always find the same result, that there is people who have had an experience abroad are more likely to indicate environmental protection and fighting climate change as one of the three priorities that the EU should focus on, compared to people who didn't have any experience abroad. Usually, the parameter of interest in propensity score matching is ATT, which is the average treatment on the treated. As you can see, the values, they range from 0.02 to 0.048. So it means that basically students who have had an educational experience abroad are between 2 percentage point and 4.8 percentage point more likely to be aware of the importance of the environment compared to people who didn't have this international education experience. So let me somehow conclude. In this paper, I've looked at whether education experience abroad influence young people environmental attitudes, using a large scale international survey covering 27 European Union countries, where you have more than 25,000 observations. We have found that international education mobility is likely to have a modest but statistically significant positive impact on environmental concern. I think here the important thing to say is that the result, so this result is consistent no matter what technique is used in order to control for selection into studying abroad. As I said at the beginning, for quantitative studies, when you're looking at outcome from studying abroad, addressing the selection issue is the most important challenge. So here in my paper, I've demonstrated that using descriptive statistics, using multivariate regression, and using propensity score, you always somehow get the same result. So we are relatively quite confident in saying that there is a positive effect of studying abroad on environmental awareness. So students are more likely to become aware about environmental issue while studying abroad, although this effect is modest. If you want to interpret this effect, I think that this mild effect is the result of two effects: little or no impact for the majority of participants who already had strong environmental attitudes before studying abroad, and a significant influence on a small group of study abroad students who didn't have at all a prior sustainability mindset. So basically, this experience is likely to have had no impact for the majority of study abroad participants who had strong pre-environmental attitudes before studying abroad, but had a strong impact on a small group of study abroad participants who didn't have a prior sustainability mindset. Very quickly, two suggestions for future research. I think one, future research should kind of look more at the mechanisms through which education experience abroad may promote environmental awareness. At the beginning of the presentation, I did mention two channels. First, the exposure of study abroad students to the rules, cultural values and norm of those countries. And the second channel could be the interaction of study abroad students with fellow students coming from other parts of the world. Now, I was not able to test any of these channels. I think this is perhaps a challenge for future study. The second, I think, idea that I have is that somehow I've looked at the effect of studying abroad on environmental awareness, but I was not able to look whether the increased environmental awareness that is caused by studying abroad translates into pro-environmental behaviors or actions. So in other words, is it thanks to the fact that students have been abroad, that students, once they come to their country of origin, they become, for instance, to use more often reusable bags, or they start to use transport means that do not pollute, or they start to value biodiversity. So that studying abroad not only affect environmental awareness, but also make students take more often pro-environmental actions and behaviors. And I stop here. Thank you for the attention.
Great. Thank you so much, Giorgio. I think, again, that's such a wonderful, rigorous analysis that is also quite sobering and leaves us a lot to be thinking about. Now, colleagues, we're at the time for questions and comments to our two panelists. You should all now have access for microphone and camera if you would like to raise a hand and ask a question out loud. Otherwise, you can add to the chat and I can ask them on your behalf. There's a question here from Jan first, who couldn't stay for the answer due to another meeting, but I think the question is a really essential one and one that I wanted to ask as well. So the question for both of you is, in your view, how can the positive benefits of international student mobility how can positive benefits of international student mobility for environmental awareness be balanced out against its negative effects on the climate and carbon footprint? So I don't know, colleagues, if either of you have some thoughts you would like to share about that question.
I go first, then I give the floor to. I think he's potentially, we're talking before the meeting started about, policy issues. No, I think this is definitely a very important policy question. No, now I'm not too sure how you would be able to do so, because I tell you what is one challenge. I don't have a solution, but one challenge is exactly what has clearly emerged from the two presentations today, that somehow one issue, which is the issue to what extent, studying abroad, so I don't know, people traveling, etc., do affect the planet, which is for me like a system macro question. Okay. And then on the other end, you have what I was talking about, which are the benefits that students they get by being abroad in terms of environmental awareness, which is an individual level outcome. So on the one end, you have got a macro issue, and on the other end, you have got a micro issue. Okay. So obviously there are ways around to do this, and the only way around would be to try to, you cannot disentangle a macro issue in a macro issue into micro issues. What you can do is you can aggregate micro issue to form a macro issue. So the way to do that would be somehow to construct some kind of macro variable aggregating all the individual benefits in terms of environmental awareness coming from study abroad, and compare it with the macro issue. And to be honest with you, the only things that comes to my mind would be to try to come up with some kind of cost benefit analysis, but I would have to think more about how to do this.
Yeah, I'd also like to say it's much more complicated than that. Study abroad travel is always an environmental cost. So sometimes if people come from very energy intensive locations and they go somewhere for half a year where actually they can use public transport, and their living arrangements and so on might actually reduce their overall environmental impact. So while obviously travel does have environmental impact, sometimes the overall cost might be very different. Yeah, and as Giorgio has identified, it's very already highlighted, it's very difficult to compare these two things. So we do obviously know the individual environmental cost of specific actions such as travel, but the benefits are quite difficult to quantify and assess and really know in detail. But also then we don't always know what should we comparing it to. So we're looking at study abroad. Is it better if people just travel for holidays? If they're going to be traveling anyway, so we don't always, just because if it'd be reducing something, we don't know what else might be kind of replacing that same thing. So yeah, so again, I think there was another question about potentially about climate anxiety for international students and young people as well, and teaching about it and teaching about actions that people can take, but also being careful about how we kind of framing it in terms of the individual level accountability versus kind of the policy actions that also need to take place. Yeah.
If I may add, I think there is also a timing issue, because the issue is the following: that imagine that by studying abroad or by being abroad, people become more aware of environment. So they also somehow change their attitudes and behavior. So they are more likely to undertake for environmental action. This will potentially last for all the rest of their life. Okay. So basically, the kind of benefits are somehow spread, hopefully, for a long period of time. On the other end, the cost, okay, they are only localized for a short period of time. That is basically, when students they are abroad. To account for this is difficult, because the cost and the benefits, they have two different time dimensions that you need to take into account if you want to do things properly.
I think you both raised really interesting reflections for me on how I think often when we speak about the environmental harm related to international students, there's a preoccupation with airplanes and kind of calculating the emissions for that initial travel. But of course, not all students even use airplanes to get to where they're studying. And I think you're showing how that kind of cost benefit analysis there is much more complex than just the emissions that come off the airplanes that send students, which is something that I don't think as a field we have really followed the kind of life cycle of environmental impact of international study. There's another question in the chat, which I think, Pii-Tuulia, you've started to answer in a way, but a question from Gabard, who is saying there's a recent article in the Times Higher Education about the risks of sustainability burnout, and they're asking, are you aware of universities or university lecturers who are specifically addressing these risks in line with best practice? Another good hard question.
Personally, I'm not aware. Also, perhaps a justification is that I kind of rejoined academia only 6-7 months ago. So, I've only taught a couple of courses since I've rejoined. So I've not been in contact with a lot of students or a lot of lecturers. Certainly is a nice question. Something to think about for sure.
Pii-Tuulia,
Yeah, so
any ideas?
there's definitely some kind of case studies, but I think individual practices are very difficult to assess as well as lecturers. But I think a lot of people teaching sustainability are aware of the aspects that if it's too overwhelming, it's kind of out of your control, then sometimes it doesn't lead to like good practices. So people have to have control and agency, and we have to somehow separate the issues from the high level to kind of practical action points as well, so people can feel that they're actually making an impact and are able to engage as well. So to address some of those issues. But yeah, I think Sylvie, maybe, I don't know if she had a comment on or wanted to comment on that question as well, or had a different question.
Yeah, Sylvie, over to you.
A different question. So I don't want to interrupt if you have more to say.
Go ahead, Sylvie.
Okay. Just thinking about the discussion so far, I have a question about. I think my concern about some of the sustainability conversations is there's a tendency to focus specifically on international student mobility as the sort of most obvious, like Jenna was saying, use of airplanes and repeated travel. Like the wider climate change debate, I think there is a tendency to focus on individual actions, like reusable cups and tote bags and plane travel, rather than the systemic institutional efforts. And so I wondered if you guys are aware of any relative impact assessments of the different sustainability impacts of, for example, ISM versus, let's say, staff conferences or like other business travel. Because I think that might be a useful place to start with the previous question about the benefit, continuing to defend the benefits of some physical mobility.
I'm asked that question quite often, but I don't think there's really been anything that would be kind of has done that comprehensively. There's definitely been studies that have, for example, looked at, digital delivery versus in-person delivery requiring travel and costs of conferences. I think why the discussion quite often does move to the footprint of international student mobility is that it is the largest footprint of international operations and actually many universities as well. And I guess the accountability for me is not for those individual students at all, but it is basically if your whole operation model is based on that mobility, then you have to take accountability that that's part of your model. Because it is part of your scope 3, people coming to you if they can't actually travel in other ways or they can't engage in education in other ways as well. But of course, it's not all of it. So there's also a lot of, other kind of environmental costs associated with those kind of operations. Yeah, so I'm not looking at it putting the accountability on the individual students, but I'm expecting that if universities want to be involved in it and they expect students to be able to travel, then they have to also be able to be accountable for that kind of footprint as well. But yeah, maybe Giorgio has any examples of kind of, I don't know, cost benefit assessments of different options, but yeah.
Unfortunately, I'm not of great help because, to be honest with you, it's not that I have done a lot of research on, the environmental impact of studying abroad. The only paper I've done is the one I presented. Usually, I more look at, labor market outcomes of studying abroad. What I know for sure is that I think the European Commission has done, a couple of studies more in line with what Sylvie was mentioning. So, what are the environmental costs associated for us, for instance, with the implementation of the Erasmus program? So it has more kind of looked at systemic macro indicators rather than looking at individuals' gains for students in terms of environmental consciousness. For me, what is clear, having researched the area of studying abroad for a number of years, is that the studying abroad has an impact on a wide variety of outcomes. Some of these outcomes have kind of emerged only recently. So more and more, what is needed is to try to really, come up with an overall evaluation of studying abroad, where all the cost and benefit across all different discipline and aspect they are considered. And as we said before, one challenge would be exactly to try to kind of put together micro issues with macro issues, because the environmental impact of studying abroad so far, especially Europe, has always been taught as a macro issue rather than a micro issue.
Yeah. There are a couple of examples within the chat of different initiatives for encouraging students or conference attendees to take more sustainable travel. There's an example in Finland, for example, that encourages students to take trains, buses, and ferries rather than planes, and that there's small incentives like travel grants. I wonder if you have any comments on those types of initiatives. Is that kind of starting to get to the issues that that are at hand, do you feel they are kind of a plaster over a wider issue? What's your thoughts on these kind of movements?
Yeah, there are a lot of different initiatives, and the question is also for universities and other organizations: how do you make it easiest for people who are willing to do it? If you require people to get the fastest from A to B and they can't travel for 2 days, then it's going to be potentially, saying, well, you can't use this kind of travel mode, or sometimes, flying might be cheaper than, train or something else. So it's about how does your kind of institutional policies also support aspects like that. So there's definitely different activities and initiatives going globally, which is quite interesting. And actually, just coming to maybe back to Giorgio's research as well, and so there's quite a few studies done in study abroad space in the US about sustainability attitudes as well, and quite often when they've been testing different things, just being overseas sometimes has as good impact on your sustainability attitudes than just staying home and studying sustainability. So there's definitely value in the international student experience and being exposed to those different aspects. And yeah, hopefully if we are able to have more kind of studies, what you've been doing as well, we're able to kind of quantify that better. And as you said, also follow up with the behaviors, because that's kind of the different aspects as well in terms of we know the attitude behavior gap is something that does exist, and then also kind of be able to say, well, what is the kind of impact and in what time frame as well. So it is still quite a new area of research in a lot of the different questions that do exist within the field. So it's about just kind of chipping away on them one by one. Yeah.
Pii-Tuulia is perfectly right. I mean, the example that is mentioned on the chat about these initiatives taken at university level, they make me think exactly what I was saying at the end of my presentation, that about the mechanisms through which study abroad students they become more environmental aware, they change their attitude. No, so for instance, I don't know, this example in Finland, students who have gone through this, perhaps they want to try to replicate this behavior when they are back at their country of origin. You see, these small things, they help people to reflect, and this kind of reflection, they become part of themselves, and therefore this helps people changing their environmental attitude when they return to their country. But yes, more example like these help us, or potentially may help research to identify the mechanism. That is what I was talking about.
Yeah, thank you. I think a question I wanted to end with, unless we get some more questions in the chat, but across this conference or panel season, what we have been trying to do is connect some of the really important issues that people are bringing up in their presentations back to the research field. I think both of you have started that in your presentation about next steps you would like to see from this work. But I wonder if you could talk about that on a little bit more of a macro level. So what kind of research agenda does our field need in order to address the really wide range of planetary and environmental concerns that you've both outlined, both in your presentations and in the discussion here? So what comes next for the field? What does the field need?
Do you want to go first, Giorgio?
Okay, I mean, I somehow, for me, I'm a quantitative person, no? So I don't think I've written anything somehow where data and numbers are not involved, no? There is a bit of trade-off. The trade-off is that ideally you want to use a big data set that includes, I know, people from different countries across a number of years, so that your results somehow have a general impact, no? But if you want to do so, it is extremely difficult to get hold of a rich data set that is able somehow, for instance, to shed light on the mechanisms through which studying abroad may promote environmental awareness. Because, for instance, the example that here is in the chat is about a university in Finland that has this initiative. Okay, so ideally you could say, okay, let's try to get data for these students who have been exposed to this before they come abroad, when they are abroad, and after they are abroad, and try to find out to identify whether this mechanism has had any effect or not. But this is this is one university. Okay, it is impossible to get a data set where you have, I don't know, thousands of universities collecting this data about this initiative. So there is a bit the challenge between doing a good research, adding something new, for instance, about the mechanism, okay, but based on a case study on a university, whose result may not be generalizable, okay, or using a large data set like the one I've used before, but then not being able to describe the mechanism, perhaps just tells what is the outcome without digging too much into this. I think here, for me, is the big challenge. The big challenge is the trade-off that exists between going deeper into a topic, okay, but using a case study, or coming up with a general results that may hold, but without providing a lot of details. And I want to conclude by saying that I wouldn't expect, kind of big organization collecting big data through big survey to go to this level of details. If we want to this level of details, I think research themselves would need to organize themselves about, and this happens somehow, for this COVID-19 survey where different universities are. Otherwise, this is not possible.
Yeah. I guess in terms of the kind of teaching and learning and international student, I think Hongping Zhang summarized some of those kind of future ideas quite well in the discipline guide that we authored. For myself, because I'm more interested in organizations, and we see that international education, international offices are now maturing in the sustainability space. It's not a new question anymore as it used to be. I'd be really interested in kind of understanding those day-to-day realities and paradoxes and tensions that do exist when you're trying to integrate sustainability questions, where quite often also having to have the financial and profit kind of narratives and priorities considered, and how they kind of work through that kind of complexity and those tensions as well. And yeah, so but that's more kind of what I'd be kind of more interested in understanding, because that kind of decides what's actually happening within and how that's kind of implemented as well. And again, while the discussion today was quite focused on, we have a lot of people from Europe. It's good to understand that not all of the world is like Europe. I can tell you that you can get to New Zealand no other way than by flying, and we have very bad any type of public transportation or trains or anything. And Australia is kind of the same, obviously, international students coming in, and so Europe is in a kind of a good position in many ways because the infrastructure exists and works better, but not everybody is kind of in the same bubble, unfortunately. But yeah, so it's good to have those kind of global views from elsewhere, from the States, Europe, Asia, Africa as well, considered, and we quite often don't really hear much about, for example, the African practices in this way, or the African student views on sustainability as well. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Thank you both so much. I think this has been such a wonderful discussion. I came into this session feeling rather cynical about international education and feeling it did more harm than good, but now I've walked away feeling that it's a much more complex picture than my initial assumptions. And I think that was the purpose of why we wanted to bring both of you here to have this conversation. So just to say thank you to everyone in the room today for your questions and comments and really wonderful discussion. This is the end of our RIS panel season. Again, you can catch up with all of our previous sessions, most of our previous sessions on our YouTube page, and we look forward to future events through the network. If there's any suggestions or ideas that people would like to think about more in relation to international students, please feel very welcome to reach out at any point. But allow me to give a virtual round of applause to our two speakers, and thank you so much for your contributions. Lovely to see everyone today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.